Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Trey Davis, Vice President of Membership and Marketing at ULI. I'd like to welcome you to today's member webinar and introduce our moderator, Justin Schor. Justin is a principal at Wells & Associates, and he has more than 20 years of experience in transportation demand management. He has helped to develop, start up, and manage TDM programs for a range of public and private sector clients. Justin is also the author of Building a Multimodal Future, published in 2019 by ULI and available through the ULI bookstore and on Amazon. My pleasure now to turn it over to you, Justin.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, Trey, and thank you everybody for joining us today. You know, I was recently on a flight to Houston on Southwest, and if you've ever been on Southwest Airlines, they tend to have a good sense of humor. And while I was on, they said, "This is the flight to Houston. If you're not going to Houston, please let us know." And I always wonder how you got on the plane if you didn't have the right ticket. But that said, this title is slightly different than what you may have seen in earlier communications or what you signed up for. And we thought that it more accurately reflected how things work in Cambridge, and that what we're really doing is enabling growth without the downside of gridlock. So there's a difference in title, but it's still the same great content. And we're really excited to share what we have with you today. This panel that we've got allows you to hear from two different perspectives, from professionals with extensive experience working to enable growth without gridlock in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One of those perspectives is the local government perspective we're going to hear, and the other is from the perspective of a developer. But before we talk about their specific experience in Cambridge, I'm going to share how their solutions fit into trends that are happening nationally. And although Cambridge is definitely the first in the country, or one of the first at least, to have done this and has been highly successful, there are numerous communities doing this, and they're all a little different. And so we'll share a little bit with you about how this fits into the larger context. But right now I'm going to introduce my fellow panelist. I am on the left here. I'm first going to introduce Stephanie Groll with the City of Cambridge. Now, Stephanie is the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Planning Officer at the City of Cambridge. And she is responsible for administering what's called the TDM ordinance, which she'll talk a little bit about today, which is a national model for reducing drive-alone trips to different properties. She works with developers and property owners to encourage people to walk, to bike, to ride transit, to carpool to their sites, just not drive alone. And Stephanie is managing the development of the new mobility blueprint to develop actionable recommendations for policies, programs, and regulations that are going to help implement new mobility options in a way that advances existing values and policies. She's also engaged in an effort to develop a coordinated micromobility policy for the Boston region. So we're excited to hear her perspective as somebody who is actually implementing and managing it and administering these policies that she'll talk about in a little bit. And joining Stephanie today, coming and sharing the developer perspective, is Rob Dickey. And Rob is with Leggat McCall Properties. He's an executive vice president there, and he's responsible for managing all of Leggat McCall Properties development business, playing a key role in client development and serving on the investment committee. He's got expertise in acquisition, in development, in property management with key institutional, corporate, and investor clients across a wide array of project types. And Rob brings more than 30 years of experience to his firm. As it relates, again, to the City of Cambridge and what we're talking about today, Rob was responsible for overseeing one of the first projects in the City of Cambridge a number of years ago to have gone through this TDM process, and has seen it evolve over time and seen how things actually have played out once they've been implemented. So he's got a really interesting and broad perspective to share today. But first, again, I promised you that I would talk a little bit just to provide some context about what's going on nationally. And Trey mentioned a book that we recently published that talks about that, again, looks at 10 different jurisdictions across the country and how they all, do it. And everybody does it a little different. And this book is really designed to help you understand which approach makes most sense for your community, but we want to share a more in-depth look at Cambridge, which is definitely one of the leading examples. But the big question is, why are we even having this conversation? And in 2015, ULI released a publication that indicated that most Americans, 52% of them, are really looking for a lifestyle where they use their car less. Most people don't want to be driving around everywhere and stuck in traffic. And compared that to a younger generation of millennials who even more so have a desire to have less car use in their life. And, we're approaching 2/3 of the population that were polled in that study found that. So there are more people looking to use their cars less. But, we all in the planning community, developers, local governments, et cetera, understand that responding to that demand requires having more mixed use, high density development where you don't depend on your car as much. And so, this equation that we see is high density mixed use, less cars, and you have more people who are walking around and don't have to drive. They can complete their trips, once they are at their home or work destination. They don't have to drive around to do everything. The challenge is that when many communities are trying to build higher density mixed use that supports that kind of development, the perception is that it's not actually going to reduce traffic. You're adding more people. The perception is that that's going to add more traffic and more parking problems. And really the thing we want to highlight here is the difference in how that graphic looks on the right. Back here, it shows less cars, and here it shows more. And again, we know that the reality at the end of the day will be less cars, but we have to get people over their perceptions. The solution to overcoming that perception and bringing the reality that we all know will happen with the right mixture of uses and density is this transportation demand management. It's, that's the technical term for people not driving alone, essentially. And as you can see here, when you add in getting people to change their behavior from driving alone to riding a bicycle, to taking transit, to carpooling, teleworking, walking, all of those things contribute to helping reduce the numbers of cars in that community. And that's the ultimate goal of that equation on the right. So what does that have to do with development? Like, that sounds like something, that maybe is a regional government problem or something else. And the thing that's important, we've learned, and certainly the city of Cambridge has learned, and many other communities across the country, is that at the end of the day, it's the buildings that have the people. And the people are who make different travel choices, and that's what generates the traffic. And in order to reduce the traffic, you really need to engage with the people in those buildings. And so there's, only so much you can provide in terms of infrastructure before you have to really interact with human beings. So that is where it starts to become important to say, how do we engage with that development community? And one of the ways that many communities have found they can do that is by leveraging permitting or the rezoning process to require new developments to provide those TDM strategies. Again, all of those non-driving solutions in their buildings. And I guess, then the question becomes, well, why would a developer do that? And that sounds like an expense. There's some programmatic elements. We're talking about dealing with people on an ongoing basis. What's in it for a developer? And there's really two sides to this. One is increasing revenue, and the other is decreasing cost. And as it relates to the increase in revenue, obviously with increased density, you can get a higher ROI per square foot by going vertically, which is a huge advantage. And so if you can offer higher density in return for a commitment to reduce the amount of traffic or parking, that's a win. Having greater flexibility with land uses and less stringent setbacks are also ways that many communities have identified that they can offer an increase in revenue to a developer while getting the goals that they want, which is the reduction in traffic and parking. In terms of decreasing costs, there are a number of typical development requirements that can be offset by applying TDM and making a condition of development. So one of those, an example would be reduced need for traffic signals. And as many folks know, I mean, that can be $250,000 to $500,000 for a signalized intersection. So we're talking about saving money there. Or the bigger one, you know, if you're going underground with parking and that costs you $40,000 a space and you can reduce 100 spaces because you have a TDM program, that's saving you a lot of money. Being able to have a more expedient and predictable development process. If I can bring my product to market faster because I know what's entailed with the TDM policy, then great. You know, we're all working together here and I can start recovering some of the revenue and paying off some of my loans. And again, if we're building less parking, a whole less level, I can bring my project to market faster because I'm saving time on construction. And certainly in many jurisdictions with any new development, you're asked to add an extra lane because of concerns with additional traffic. And so if we can demonstrate that through TDM there will be less traffic, then we don't need to build those lanes, and that can be a significant savings as well. So as I mentioned, this is happening all over the country, and you know, this is extracted from the book. There are, you know, many more communities since the book was written that have started to do this. Austin, Texas is one as well. You're seeing it pop up all over the country, but the big regions, you know, working from West Coast to East Coast, the San Francisco region, the Seattle region, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., and Boston, all have multiple local jurisdictions within them that are doing these types of TDM policies as a condition of development. But today we're going to focus specifically on that northeastmost section of the country in Boston and focus more specifically on Cambridge. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Stephanie Groll to talk about the local government perspective of this policy and how it works as somebody administering it. Stephanie?
Cambridge is a small urban city located just across the Charles River from Boston. And in just over 6 square miles, we have 113,000 residents whose median age is just over 30 years old. So it's in general a very young population. And we have 134,000 jobs. Under our current zoning, we expect about 10,000 new housing units by 2030 and 32,000 new jobs. But those projections would increase when we adopt our Envision Cambridge plan, which is the result of our 3-year citywide planning process. The greater Boston area has 5 million residents, and people travel without paying much attention to town boundaries. So 75% of transportation within Cambridge starts or ends outside of city limits. We have one of the region's primary economic engines in Kendall Square, which is a center of biotech and technology companies working closely with our universities. And that's a lot of economic activity. We could not continue to grow if everyone uses a single occupancy vehicle to get around. So we adopted the PTDM ordinance, that's the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, in 1998 to improve mobility and access, reduce traffic congestion and air pollution, and increase safety by promoting walking, biking, public transit, and other sustainable modes. It's part of a long-term city strategy to design streets and focus our policies in ways that give people choices for getting around. The ordinance grew out of the Vehicle Trip Reduction Ordinance, which identified the need to reduce vehicle trips as a way to address air pollution concerns and also livability issues like traffic congestion and noise. It also enables growth by reducing the negative impacts of development. So PTDM was originally approved with a sunset clause, and then the City Council extended the program with another sunset clause, and then finally decided to make it permanent in 2006. So the way it works is, under the Clean Air Act in 1990, Cambridge counted up all of the parking spaces on non-residential parcels. And when a property owner wants to increase the number of spaces on their site, it triggers PTDM. So we use parking as the trigger because we know that adding parking generates drive-alone trips, and parcels with 5 to 19 parking spaces become a small project, and 20 or more spaces becomes a large project. So if a property is subject to the ordinance, they can only receive city permits when an owner has an approved PTDM plan. The PTDM ordinance also has an enforcement provision that is essential to making sure that people comply. So if a property owner is out of compliance in some way, the city can fine it $10 per space per day and shut down the parking facility until it comes back into compliance. But we've never had to enforce on a property because just the threat of enforcement has brought movement on their part. All large plans have a few things in common. Number one, a commitment to limit the percent of drive-alone trips to a specific number coming to their site. Number two, a commitment to provide various transportation demand management measures. These are the programs that will shift people into sustainable transportation choices. And number three, an annual monitoring plan. Their package of TDM measures needs to be robust enough to be able to reach their SOV commitment. And in order to ensure compliance, we also have annual monitoring. So they have to demonstrate every year that they have met their goal. The monitoring starts about a year after the parking starts being used, and they show whether the single occupancy vehicle mode split commitment has been achieved and whether they are implementing all of the TDM measures. So monitoring is essential because it helps us understand how effective the measures are. We always add in our approval letter additional reasonable measures in case they fail the mode split commitment. Here are some results from 2018. We currently have 74 approved plans for large project PTDM and non-residential special permit projects. So I'm including special permit projects here because that's another way that we require TDM measures and monitoring, even if it doesn't trigger the PTDM ordinance. So through these two mechanisms, we can influence the travel choices of a huge portion of people who work in Cambridge. So in 2018, the city received reports for 51 PTDM and special permit projects, and that represents 26,000 parking spaces and 32 million square feet of development. Our regulated projects now cover the commuting activities of about 45,000 employees, which is 35% of all employees in Cambridge, and approximately 10,000 graduate and primary school students. Up until recently, we measured the success of the PTDM program by comparing our SOV rate to American Community Survey results. The bar on the left shows that 36% of people in monitored properties drive alone to work, compared with 43% in the American Community Survey. But through Envision Cambridge, that 3-year planning process that I mentioned before, we set a goal to have no more than 32% of people who work in Cambridge drive alone to work. So we have 11 percentage points to go before we meet that goal. So here are the last 10 years of employee commute results. And you can see that the drive alone rate for people in regulated properties has come down to 36%. And we're still finalizing the 2019 data, but it's in the same range. So the downward trend is good, but we see that it has to come down more. So we're looking for ways to update the PTDM ordinance to further reduce drive alone trips. So the PTDM ordinance has a lot of strengths. We don't hear a lot of opposition from developers because probably because they realize that PTDM is part of the cost of doing business in Cambridge and that we would not be able to approve as many projects without it. The fact that we collect so much data on the performance of each project has been invaluable in our planning. So it's helping us in guiding, the development of new plans and where we put our bike share stations and what transit connections we're lacking. And it goes on and on. There's been a really nice culture shift in employer benefits in Cambridge. So in early plans, we were requiring benefits that many jobs had already been offering. And now there are other unregulated properties that are starting to offer them because they've become the norm in Cambridge. So many people offer these benefits that other companies who are not required to are starting to. On the policy side of transportation, I'm on the policy side of transportation, but there's a whole team of people working on the infrastructure side. And they're putting in bus priority lanes and safe bike lanes and crosswalks. And these are all the things that make people feel like they can get to work by walk, bike, and transit in a way that's safe and quick and comfortable. So if all we did was require that people get to work this way, but didn't support it with good infrastructure, we wouldn't have the same results that we currently have. Our larger planning processes, like Envision, set district and citywide goals that make it much easier for me to negotiate robust PTDM plans. So everybody is living by the same rules in Cambridge, and the city's expectations are all clearly spelled out. And the last strength is that the plans are very flexible. If something isn't working, as PTDM officer, I can work with the property owner to amend the plan administratively, and in many cases, they do not have to go back to the planning board for further approvals. So what are some opportunities? If I had it to do all over again, I would make a few changes. I would definitely include residential properties, because right now we require TDM measures for residential properties through special permits, but there's no enforcement mechanism that's built into it, so it's less flexible. We could also adjust the trigger so we could impact more properties. The percent of properties under PTDM increases every year, but that could be done at a faster rate if the trigger was lower. We can move to a system that limits the total number of drive-alone trips instead of measuring the percentage of drive-alone trips. And on the operations side, we need a web-based form for people to submit their annual data. So my staff doesn't need to do data entry, which can be inefficient and can introduce errors. And anytime we reduce the amount of negotiation in a plan, it's better. So with TDM measures, we already know what works best. Having people pay daily for parking and giving them at market rate and giving them sustainable transportation subsidies is the best way to reduce their SOV rates. If those were standard TDM measures that were in every single plan, the performance of the projects would be assured. And then surrounding towns like Boston, Somerville, Arlington, and Watertown are starting to require TDM measures with development, which is great. But I would like to see a statewide program in place so that property owners couldn't say they're just going to take their development just over the town boundary to somewhere else, that it would be something that would be expected of everybody in Massachusetts. And while I like keeping parking as the trigger, because that's the thing that generates drive-alone trips, we are trying to find ways to deal with the impact of Uber and Lyft. People are building less parking, which is good, but we're still seeing a lot of SOV trips from the ride-hail world. If PTDM were achieving everything that we wanted, we would have more development with no additional traffic. Developers would save on the cost of parking and then pass that savings on to tenants and also use that savings to offset the cost of keeping retail alive. And the success of the program would convince brokers that they could lease up space that has less parking than they're used to seeing. The last one is a big one. So we'd meet our climate goals by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to transportation. But I think we're going to pass it now over to Rob for his part.
So just as a little background, and I think this is particularly helpful probably for people that aren't as familiar with Cambridge and in the overall Boston market, is that really the genesis of all this is, Stephanie described it back in 1998, was around a city that was, developing fairly rapidly commercially and had high growth rate on jobs, was becoming an innovation center around MIT and Harvard, and was experiencing growth in a way that was new, and also there was some resistance to. So you had what was called the interim planning overlay petition, which was essentially a one-year moratorium on development in the late 90s. That it was triggered by, concerns among residents, city staff that were trying to manage growth, and city council that felt at a certain level that they needed to take a pause and look at making some changes so that they could properly and intelligently sort of prosecute development applications. And a big so there were zoning changes that came of that that particularly focused on larger projects and specifically focused on traffic impacts related to larger projects, and gave the planning board a little bit more scientific way to evaluate traffic impacts, and particularly impacts on residential neighborhoods in Cambridge. Cambridge as a city is a place that is extremely busy during the workday, and over the weekend acts more like a town, I would say. And I think people wanted to manage the growth intelligently, and come up with tools to do that. So as Stephanie mentioned, PTDM was adopted in 1998, and let's get to the next slide. So I was doing development in Cambridge at the time. I was involved in a number of different projects, and as a development community, I would say the initial reaction to this, to both PTDM, but maybe more specifically to Cambridge's move to use parking as a, to constrain the parking supply as a tool to reduce traffic and change and modify driving behavior was a big part of what was going on. So Stephanie's programs were sort of a byproduct or growth from the traffic department that looked at, parking supply and said, if we reduce the ratios that developers are building to, and we reduce the overall parking supply, manage growth, and manage SOV utilization, this will benefit us in the long term. And that idea was, I would say, relatively new to the development world, and there were key concerns around it. So as a developer and with investors and with other users, we looked at essentially the fear that this would affect a new project's ability to get financing, that from a leasing standpoint, reduced parking ratios would be perceived as a new development's disadvantage over an existing building that was across the street that had higher parking ratios, and that this would ultimately affect property values. And then there was the fear on the cost side that cost and operating side that tenants wouldn't adopt PTDM measures and costs, and that the incremental costs to a lease rate would make certain properties non-competitive. So at that time, in Boston, the suburban parking ratios were at, in the 128 West community, sort of the closest in suburb, they were at 3 to 3.5 per thousand. And in Cambridge, they ranged, but they were probably averaging about 2 to 2.5 per thousand. Maybe on an occasion slightly below 2, but more or less somewhere between 2 and 2.5 per thousand for commercial space. So I'm going to go through 3 examples. There are 3 projects that I was involved in, and I picked them because they represent what I'll call sort of the beginning of PTDM, maybe the middle of PTDM, and where we are today. And I think Stephanie would aptly describe these as being projects where we moved from a relatively light PTDM agreement with the city to one that was a little more robust, to one on the last example that represents many and almost all of the ideas that are part of Stephanie's program now. So this was a project that was permitted in 2000, as Stephanie described earlier. We triggered this under PTDM under the new ordinance because we were developing an old industrial site that had been owned by Polaroid. It was an existing building of about 50,000 square feet with on 6 acres that was, and some industrial buildings in the back that were torn down, and a limited amount of surface parking that supported that operation. So those, in our development, we were adding significantly more than the 20 spaces to trigger the ordinance of new parking, and we went through a permitting process for a mixed-use project in addition to the building that was on the site that had already been permitted 60,000 square feet. We added two buildings of 100,000 square feet of commercial space and a 120-unit housing project on the back part of the site. The commercial ratio we ended up at was, at the time, 1.5 spaces per 1,000. As I mentioned, this was one of the earlier, if not, I think it was one of the first 3 PTDM plans approved in the city. And locationally, this project is on the river, fairly far away from public transit or train transit. Has okay but not great bus access, and represented, you know, a 15-minute plus walk to the nearest MBTA Red Line station at Central Square. So I would say, in perspective here, we felt, you know, we felt like we were part of a new program. We felt challenged in the market to potentially market this space at the low parking ratio, given that we weren't right on the red line. And ultimately, I would say this was a successful project, but it was successful in part because the 2 buildings we built were immediately converted to lab buildings for lab tenancy, and the ratio of the density of occupancy within the buildings was substantially lower than office. And I think it made, I think honestly in this case, PTDM wasn't so much what made this work. I think it was more the tenancy and the makeup of this project in the ultimate development that made it function day one and work under the new program. So this next example was permitted in 2008 and built in 2011-2012 timeframe. So this is a 115,000 square foot lab. It was permitted as part of a planned unit development, inclusive of 2 housing projects. There were 3 different properties involved. This was permitted at a commercial ratio of 0.9 per 1,000. It was planned as a lab building and planned to accommodate, you know, research tenants at a slightly lower density than office. Unlike the other property, it is within a reasonable walking distance of Kendall Square MBTA station and the MIT campus. It's also 10 minutes the other direction to a Green Line station. So this had better transit access. There was more robust PTDM measures built into this, and this is operated very successfully. And when I get to the third example, I'll describe a little bit what the additional PTDM measures means and describe, you know, what the evolution of that program has been. So this is a project that was originally permitted in 2014, but is ultimately went through some changes and received a second special permit just recently, and is moving forward into development in the next month or 2. So this is a 470,000 square foot project. It's mixed use. It has 48 housing units. It has ground floor amenity and retail space supporting neighborhood demand as well as building demand. It has a child care facility on the first floor. It has a community room that serves residents, and it is next to a municipal parking garage of the city. So the commercial parking ratio here is 0.85 per 1,000. The space is in the building that supports is the 400,000 square feet of office and dry research space. So this will not be a wet lab facility, but will rather appeal to tech tenants linked to MIT and the Innovation Center at Kendall Square. Similar to the other project, which is close by, it's a 10-minute walk to the Kendall Square Red Line and likewise to the Cambridge Crossing Leachmere Green Line MBTA station, which is going through reconstruction right now. And in terms of the PTDM measures that this project has adopted, and which represent that evolution that we talked about, it has 100% transit pass subsidies for tenants of the building and their employees that are using public transportation. That program is partially extended to residents of the 48 units as well. It has major bike program incentives, both at the property and in the garage, related to the garage next door. So in the building itself, it has a very large bike room for each of the components, the residential, retail, and office components. It has showers and locker rooms to go along with that. It has a bike repair station, and then within the public realm, there are bike stations that are for Hubway that are run, that are run and operated by a third party, but we invest the capital as an obligation to the city to put those bike stations in place. And we have one on the property, and we have one at the parking garage. We have, we have charging for tenants individually for parking rather than having it be a pass-through in a lease, so that the actual impact of somebody driving their car to work and parking and utilizing the space on a daily or monthly basis hits them directly, rather than something that becomes a corporate or a company benefit. And that is also, that sort of direct lease program is also expanded to the residents. We have preferred parking for electric vehicle stations, which are in the building, and we have a significant number of them that we've also agreed to put in the city-owned garage next door. We have marketing programs in the building that include putting up displays to tell people about, PTDM measures and smart sort of commuting patterns, but more importantly, tell them information about availability of trains, availability of buses, and keep people apprised of their different options.
So, Rob, thank you for that, and Stephanie as well. Great background. We did want to give you a little context for how this fits into, like if this kind of thing sounds like the kind of thing that would fit in your community, wherever you are in the country. I think the big question most people have is, how do I go about starting that? And it can be a little daunting, but what we found when we did the research for this book, and we talked with people like Rob and Stephanie and others from all those other communities you saw on that map a few slides back, is that there are some common steps that have been taken that made for successful outcomes in each community. And so we tried to find those common threads across the board and say, this is the things you would need to do. Here are the first steps that you should take to ensure that yours is most successful, because we understand that your community may not be like Cambridge or Seattle or suburban Minneapolis, whatever it is. Every community is completely different. The politics are different, and the kinds of things that are driving transportation decisions are all different. But there are these common threads throughout that we talk about in the book and really get in more detail, but wanted to give you just a quick outline of what those steps are. So the first step is to really understand how the TDM policy fits into the planning fabric of the community. And by that, Stephanie alluded in her timeline to a number of different larger policy goals: sustainability, climate action, just larger comprehensive planning goals. All of those things are woven together to make this successful. So if TDM is standing out on its own, it's going to have a harder time succeeding than if it's woven into the larger fabric of your other policies that relate to planning. The second step is to, once you've figured out where that fits, is to really identify where the TDM policy should apply. Now, in Cambridge, it's a very dense city and kind of compact geographically as well. And so, it has a much broader reach. But in places where you may have something more like an overlay district, it may be very, the community may be rather spread out, but then there's certain concentrated areas where you have traffic congestion or parking challenges, and identify where that should apply. Neither one is right. You could do something across your entire jurisdiction or do a small overlay district, but understanding where you want to apply that is really the next key step. After that, it's determining the types of developments that should comply with the TDM policy. So you heard Stephanie say if she could do it all over again, she would apply the policy not just to commercial development, but also to residential development. And that's something, again, there's no right or wrong. Probably at the time that Cambridge did it, it made sense. Maybe that's where the bulk of the development was in the commercial market. And the next wave of development in recent years has been more on the residential. But determining up front, do you want it to be for all kinds of uses? We work in communities with like Fairfax County, Virginia, where retail does not apply because the idea is they want people to come and drive and shop, but they want to make sure that the residential and office are not generating traffic and parking challenges for that economic driver of the retail. The fourth step is really important, and Stephanie alluded to this. She talked about a specific number in Cambridge, and this is something that not every jurisdiction across the country does, to say you have a certain, in the case of Cambridge, SOV, single occupant vehicle or drive alone rate we're trying to achieve. Other communities like Fairfax County, Virginia do something like a peak trip generation, peak numbers of cars, which is something Stephanie said, if she could do it again, might consider that as well. There's no right or wrong, but making sure you have a number, because if nobody knows what they're striving to do, they don't really do it very effectively. And it really helps a property focus on the kinds of strategies that are going to get results. Next is to really understand the appropriate goal and to quantify the success. So, is it what I described? Is it trip generation? Is it parking generation? Is it the numbers of people driving alone? There is no right or wrong. It goes back to what your larger community policies are as they relate to sustainability, what's in your comprehensive plan, et cetera, but making sure that it's clear, that it's a goal and it's appropriate for your community. Stephanie mentioned this as well. You can set a goal, and we've found that there are communities that set goals, but they don't monitor it. And so there's really no teeth. And although that sounds like, the big bad government coming in to scrutinize you to see how you're doing, what we found in every community that has these goals that are monitored is that the development community really appreciates it. They know that they can see whether or not their money spent on these TDM programs is effective, and whether or not it's helping the larger goal. And certainly over time, they've been able to see that it has made an impact, not just at their property, but in the community as a whole, in terms of being able to grow without having more traffic, which is the title we talked about at the beginning of our presentation, the panel. And again, Stephanie talked about what are the appropriate strategies, and that certainly in our industry, we all know that, charging for parking and subsidizing transit and other forms of transportation, that combination is like the secret recipe. And there's other things you can do, like marketing and other types of encouragement to get people to change their behavior. But the exact nuance of those strategies and whether or not you're going to subsidize transit may depend on whether or not you have strong transit access to your site. So really understanding within the community, what are the appropriate strategies for the properties affected by this TDM policy? Some jurisdictions don't prescribe the strategies. They just have the goal and say, look, we trust that you'll figure out what the best strategies are for your property. We just want you to meet the goal. Again, there's no right or wrong, but you need to understand what's appropriate in your community. final, there's two more steps. One is just determine whether a TDM plan is required. And again, this is basically helping the property, the developer, know what they're committing to. And then it's something that if they sell the property can be successfully transitioned to the next owner and or property management firm, but making it very clear what you're committing to. And again, having the kind of flexibility that Stephanie mentioned, where if you need to change it, you don't have to go back for a full alteration to your conditions of development. And lastly, again, is the enforcement. How are you going to enforce this? Is there a penalty if you don't comply? Do you slow down development? Again, nobody wants to be holding a stick over your head. I think even Stephanie would admit that's not something they want to do, but if we want to see this be successful, there has to be something at stake. And what's the best way to do that? Some communities have a more robust economy and can command more on a penalty and still know that it won't stifle economic growth. Others have a little less latitude, but figuring out what the right mechanism for enforcement is really the last key element. So with that, I see that we have a number of questions, and I believe Stephanie with the ULI team is going to lead us through those questions. So we'll turn it over to her, and looking forward to talking with the whole audience.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm going to go through just some of the questions we got here. The first one looks like it's about the webinar materials being available. I know the recording will be made available afterwards to all registrants after the call. It'll be later today. But as far as the deck is concerned, that would be up to the panelists. If they want their deck included, I can absolutely include it when I send it around. Does anyone have an objection?
Nope.
No, that's fine.
Same here.
Cool. So that's good. We had that question a couple times, so I'll make sure that's skip that one. Next question I have here is, what was the parking ratio for the residential component of these mixed-use developments?
So this is Rob. I would say in Cambridge, the zoning for really most of the last 20 years has been at one space per unit. That has been modified downward substantially in the last 5 to 10 years, with recognition that projects that sit in TOD locations that utilization isn't there, and particularly with the sort of size and type units that are getting built, that the folks occupying those units are in many cases more than half of them don't own cars. So those ratios have dropped substantially. I would say this is an area that Boston is probably a little bit ahead of Cambridge on, but Cambridge is modifying zoning to keep up with what actual utilization is on the zoning side.
Okie dokie. The next question here is, how did lenders overcome fears of devaluation of property as a result of lower parking ratios? Through my work, I am still seeing this fear as a major hurdle to development in the town of Reading, Massachusetts. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think this is Rob again. I think initially it was really a bit of a challenge in Cambridge with the new provisions. That said, Cambridge enjoys, it has tended to be a good place to invest, although in the early 2000s it was still a volatile place to invest because there was a lot of high growth, low credit tenants. I would say today how that gets overcome is there's a very, very strong demand for investment in Cambridge. And I would just say to everybody in the audience that one of the ways that all of this works in Cambridge is you have a very high cost environment, and you have a very high rent environment, and you have very high valuations. So when you put the pieces together, and you have companies that are willing to pay high rents and are hiring very skilled employees and paying very high wages. So when you put all the pieces together, you have you have an increased operating cost associated with being at a property that has a robust PTDM plan, and that could be at as high as $4, $5, $6 a foot as a premium, and that would range substantially depending on the location and the plan and the specific property. But then on the capital side, you have almost 100% of the new developments in Cambridge require parking to go below grade. Justin referred to a number earlier that is maybe a cost associated with building elsewhere, but in Cambridge, below grade parking is at least $100,000 a space, and I've seen it be higher than that. So for every space you don't have to build, you have a cost savings, and you also have the ability to look forward and not be concerned about creating parking that you won't need 10 years from now, where that will be substantially underutilized. And then on the company side, who are ultimately absorbing some of the premiums here, you have companies that are adopting, as Stephanie said, programs around trying to change human behavior around driving. And so as you move from an economy 20 or 30 years ago, where the senior level management got parking benefits and drove to work because somebody handed them a free parking space, you now are really trying to incent young people who you're recruiting, and you're trying to incent younger and younger talent by giving them benefits and subsidizing transit and ways for people to get to work, and having the ability to not own a car are all benefits for people that are being recruited. So those costs borne by companies, I think, are part of the company recruitment policy as well.
Thank you. Next question is, who takes on the ongoing operation costs for PTDM measures as opposed to capital costs?
So I'll let Rob answer that from the operations side, but I would just say from the city side, the people who are responsible for implementing the PTDM plan are the property owner. So they're on the hook for implementing it or complying with it. And the property owner can choose which pieces of the plan they would like to pay for themselves and which pieces they pass on to their tenants. So most often property owners will pay for the Easy Ride shuttle into Kendall Square from North Station as a property-wide cost, but the individual transit subsidy will often be paid for by the tenant companies for each employee. Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was a great answer. And I think again, Stephanie also referred to the fact that there are companies in Cambridge, given how widespread this is at this point, that have adopted, have essentially been willing to subject themselves to PTDM plans in properties that were not zoned that way, or in situations where they're an owner-occupant of a property that was built or developed, pre-ordinance. So I think one of the things that has made this work over time is the acceptance that this is a cost of doing business in Cambridge and part of the sort of the fabric of the business community there, so to speak.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, Rob, that is something we're seeing nationally as well, that there's, after maybe 3 to 4 years of implementation of regulated properties, the properties that surround them, and I think, Stephanie, you alluded that as well, that they're beginning to see the reasons to do it, that it is actually the kind of thing, even in a multi-tenant environment, that attracts tenants. And so we're seeing, in terms of where that operating cost is coming from, in a lot of cases, actually in the marketing budget of a property, one that's not regulated, but where they're seeing that they can use that as a way to attract new tenants and retain them. So Stephanie, I think you asked if we could stay on a few extra minutes. I have flexibility, but I don't want to speak for Stephanie and Rob. It sounds like we've got a few more questions. Do you guys have a few more minutes?
I have a few more minutes, yes.
Yeah, I could do another 5 to 10.
Perfect. Oh, great. How resource intensive is monitoring and enforcement of PTDM? Is there some specific PTDM revenue source that helps fund monitoring and enforcement?
Okay, so the ordinance defines my position as the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Planning Officer. I'm funded out of the parking fund that comes to the Traffic, Parking, and Transportation Department. So the ordinance only mentions my position, but I have since grown the number of positions that I supervise. So I have 3 half-time people, so the equivalent of 1.5 other people who help me with monitoring and all sorts of things related to administering the PTDM ordinance. It definitely became necessary once the number of projects in my portfolio grew, and in order to enable me to work on things that are not strictly PTDM related, such as the new mobility blueprint and other planning activities. So the more people you have, the more projects you can manage.
And Stephanie, just to piggyback on that, some of the things we're seeing in other communities across the country, I mean, that size is probably typical when you have an active level of enforcement. In communities that may not have the kind of resources to cover that for whatever reason, you know, the actual monitoring is being, the property is being asked to do the monitoring themselves and then submitted. And that, you know, obviously there's, you know, processing of the monitoring reports and other things, but the bulk of the work is being taken on by the property themselves, and, you know, at a nominal cost to do some surveys or some traffic counts or parking counts, you know, once a year or every other year, depending on the requirements of the jurisdiction.
Yes, and I will just add to that, that the closer I look at the monitoring reports, the more accurate I find them to be. So it's very important to put a lot of resources into reviewing the monitoring reports. They're quite accurate now.
Cool. Next question here is, let's see. Have you considered or are currently studying the utilization of parking spaces? Is there an opportunity for sharing parking between developments under utilized parking reservoirs, ultimately continuing to build less parking?
So I will answer for the city side, and maybe Rob, you can talk about it from a development perspective. But from the city side, we always encourage people to share parking if possible, to use nearby underutilized parking. So we do have a shared parking piece of our zoning that allows for that and defines how it can be done. We don't have a ton of projects coming forward with this sort of an arrangement because you know, it just introduces a level of complexity to the development process that I think makes some people uncomfortable. But it's definitely something that we encourage and have been seeing more of in the last 5 years than we did in the early part of it.
So I would just add that I think, as was introduced at the beginning of this, a lot of the development going on in urban areas, and Cambridge being no different, is a mix of uses. So I would say the larger your project is and the more mix of uses, the more you can kind of leverage each of your spaces more effectively, because that sharing back and forth and that ability to use a pool of parking and to manage the utilization of that pool effectively is very helpful. I would say from a Cambridge zoning standpoint, it's difficult to meet the requirements of zoning when you don't, control all of your own parking and control it within a very small radius, because the ordinance doesn't allow you to secure parking that supports your project for zoning purposes beyond 300 feet typically, and you can go to 1,000 feet under a special permit. But again, these are things that are, from a zoning perspective, make it a little bit more difficult to comply. I would say, going back to the city's original goals set in the late 90s of using parking supply to constrain, as a tool to change human behavior and SOV utilization, the traffic department does look at different areas of the city differently from an overall parking supply standpoint, and we'll take that into consideration when they approve projects as to whether there's general capacity or not in a particular part of the city.
Yeah, just a sort of big picture plug. I think ULI just released its latest 3rd edition of its shared parking resource book that I think would speak to what both of you have described on a broader perspective as well, beyond Cambridge.
Cool. Let's go for next question here. How much does adding extra transportation options by developers influence the approval process?
So, as I mentioned, every project that is going for a special permit needs to get, if the project triggers the PTDM ordinance and it needs to have a PTDM plan, they need that approval before they can get the any of the permits. So a special permit or a building permit or occupancy permit, any of it. So I will only approve plans that I feel are robust enough to be able to meet the goals of the PTDM ordinance. So if they have the approval in hand, then that will be the indication that I think it's strong enough. But I guess that's it. That's all I would say on that one.
Cool. Let's see. Next question is, what recommendations would you advise for municipalities that do not currently have state regulations that support emission reduction?
I can take an initial stab, and then maybe Stephanie, Robbie may have some stuff to add, but this is really what I was talking about in that first step, is really understanding where this fits into the larger fabric. You don't need to have emission reductions requirements for a TDM policy to make sense for a municipality. In fact, I think in most municipalities that we've worked with across the country, it's more focused on traffic congestion as the driving force, and then very often parking as well. And those two things obviously have a direct correlation to emissions, but it really is about the economic vitality of those communities. And so if they're struggling with traffic congestion, they don't want to choke on their own success. Same with the parking supply. If it feels like the parking supply is inadequate to match the demand that's there, these communities are stepping up to make these TDM policies without having an air quality regulation in place. That said, again, and Stephanie, you can probably speak to this, we all know that there is a direct correlation to air quality benefit for having done it, but I don't think you need a regulation to inspire its creation.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Great. Let's go on to, what advice would you have for a small-ish, about 10,000 people, mostly suburban community?
That's a great question. I think there's so much context that one would need to understand about that community, where it fits in a larger region, is that, so I think, Stephanie, you alluded to this. It would be great if you had in your neck of the woods, because the jurisdictions are so small and all stacked up against each other, to have a statewide policy so that people wouldn't jump from one jurisdiction to another to avoid a certain regulation. A 10,000 person community in a high pressure, high growth market with a lot of traffic congestion can probably, withstand the backlash that might come from putting in a TDM policy until it's accepted in the way that Rob mentioned earlier. A small 10,000 person community, suburban community in a region that isn't maybe as strong economically, or that particular community isn't as strong economically, may struggle to get approval and to get support from the development community to commit to those types of development conditions. But I might default to Rob to, if he had different perspectives on that in a different size community.
So I guess I just have two thoughts. One is it's very difficult, I think, to make this work in any community that doesn't have reasonably good access to public transit, train or bus. So I think if Stephanie's job was to do what she's doing in a community that, where people were really relying on the car, period, and didn't have enough options, and it was all dependent on people living and working in places that are proximate where they can walk and bike. I think that's a tall order. I think the other thing related to communities looking at this is, how strong is the economy already, and what are the economics of projects and sort of market economies. So, what obviously makes Cambridge a very unique place is it has high demand for its commercial space. It's got limited development opportunities. There's a lot of capital looking to invest in that market, and there are buyers and investors that will pay top dollar for completed projects that are stabilized. So all of those factors make it easier to absorb the added costs that go along with this. And I think when you take the flip side of that and you have an economy that is struggling from an economic development standpoint, these measures, while still just as important, are more difficult to execute on.
Great. Next question is, often when transit options are limited, reducing parking supply can lead commuters to choose rideshare over private vehicles. However, a single occupant rideshare vehicle is still a single occupant trip on a road. Have you found success with carpooling incentive programs?
So this one is a really tough one. We are definitely seeing the Uber and Lyft trips growing. They increased between 2017 and 2018 in Cambridge by 15%. We have the highest Uber and Lyft trips per person in the state of Massachusetts. The total number of trips is the highest in Boston, but Cambridge has the highest per person. So it is a hard one. Carpooling is not a popular option. It's been dropping over the last 20 years as a choice for people commuting. But we're hoping that with programs like Waze Carpool and other new technologies that, and with the younger crowd coming up, we're hoping that people will become more and more comfortable with the idea of sharing a car with a stranger. But I have to admit, we have not cracked that nut yet. I know that right now the Kendall Square Association is doing a pilot where they are encouraging people to use Waze Carpool and other carpooling technology. So we're hoping to see some good results from that.
So this is going to be the last question that we're going to take today. Has the reduction of greenhouse gases been quantified from the use of PTMD policies? If so, how large of an impact are we talking about?
We did quantify it in 2009, and we haven't updated it since. And it's something that we are hoping to do. It's a really complicated number to get to because it involves understanding VMT, vehicle miles traveled outside of that generated by the PTDM projects. And we don't have a good data set showing non-PTDM projects. We only have our PTDM data. So it's definitely something that we are hoping to be able to do, but I don't have that number today.